In today's video, I'm going over the FOB, which is an alternative to running standard vanes or feathers for fletching on your arrows. This is probably the last gear-related video that I'm going to be able to get out before my deer season starts in North Dakota this week. And so, to give kind of a real brief history, the FOB is something that's been around for many years. It had a lot of popularity initially, and I haven't really heard much until kind of earlier this year. It seemed like they started to have more reviews pop back up on the map, and they started to get a little bit more discussion around them. I bought some on my own, so they didn't actually send me any. I bought some basically when I started doing a lot of arrow testing later into last year and earlier into this year, where I'm buying onesies and twosies from Lancaster, building up these arrows and then going out and shooting them. It's a lot more convenient for me to be able to take one of these things, pop it on the back of an arrow shaft that I just finished building essentially, head out to the range and start shooting, versus taking the fletching jig and the glue, get everything all set up and prepped just to be able to fletch one or two arrows. So that was kind of the reason why I initially purchased a couple packs for myself. So a little bit more about the design. It's basically an injection molded plastic component. There are three sort of, I guess, wings you could call them on the inside, surrounded by a ring. Each of these three rings kind of have like a 4-degree offset, and because they're surrounded by this ring, it creates additional stiffness, so they're not deforming in flight as much as you might see with a vane or a feather, and essentially that allows you to be able to get a little bit more steerage, a little bit quicker steerage with a smaller actual surface area. And I can tell by looking at kind of where the parting line is on these parts that basically this surface on the inside of this ring dips down a little bit versus the top is just kind of flat. What that tells me is more likely when you see air start to come near this FOB, it's going to draw that air more quickly through the inside of the ring than the air passing over the outside of the ring, which could again increase that airflow over those little wings and potentially be able to create a little bit quicker stabilization. They make these things for the more common diameters of arrows. So like this one right here is made for micro diameters, comes in different colors, 166 ID arrow. This one's for an X size shaft, which is a 204, which is kind of like a small diameter shaft, and they make them for other common sizes as well. One of the things I actually experimented with earlier this spring was trying to 3D print custom FOBs, where I said, okay, what happens if you take a FOB and instead of this standard diameter, what if I shrink it down by 25% and add a fourth wing? I tried a bunch of little things like that. I tried seeing what would happen if I changed the angle of that wing. I tried doing just kind of an airfoil at a 0-degree offset, kind of like the Fire Knock arrow vane. A lot of those types of tests came down ultimately to just the resolution that I could get with the 3D printers that I had access to. So I really wasn't able to get a whole lot of really useful data, but it was kind of fun to play around with when I was shooting for fun some 25% front of center setups and seeing how small of a setup I could potentially go for. But what most people are going to be interested in is, okay, well, how does the flight actually compare to what I more likely would be using, which would be like, a standard 3 fletch blazer or something along those lines. The fletching setup that I typically run on my arrows is a 4 fletch and kind of a target vane configuration. So not a high profile blazer, but still a 4 fletch. And in previous testing, it ends up being fairly similar to like a higher profile 3 fletch. And I run it with a pretty severe offset. And what I typically find is when I'm running these compact fixed blade broadheads like this, even out to 60 yards, there's really not much difference in terms of if I'm shooting the FOB versus me shooting this type of fletching configuration. If you shoot out 80, 100 yards, I just haven't tested that far, so I can't tell you if it's apples to apples at that range. The other thing I would say is if you're gonna shoot big broadheads, most likely you're gonna have to do some experimenting. I can't say for sure they're gonna work with big broadheads, but I can also say that a fletching configuration like this isn't gonna work very well for those big broadheads either, unless I'm running a super high front of center. If you're within the realm of normal arrow setups, these things likely are gonna group just as well as a standard fletching configuration in my experience. Because they are hard plastic, of course, you're gonna need to run them with a drop away arrow rest. You're not gonna be able to shoot them with a whisker biscuit. You're not gonna be able to shoot them with a prong style rest. Now, before I get into some of the pros and cons from a whitetail hunter's perspective, I did also want to touch on noise, because noise is something that when you start shooting these things, you immediately think that they do sound noticeably louder than most other fletching configurations. From the shooter's perspective, if I shoot this arrow and if I shoot this arrow, this one does sound like it has more of a whiz to it as it's going to the target. And I was reading some comments online where people were saying, yeah, well, it only sounds louder from the back, not from the animal's perspective, not from the front. And I thought, well, that seems kind of like an odd thing to say. So I went out and tested it. I put my camera out at 30 yards next to the target, and I shot both of these arrow configurations with the same broadhead, same arrow length, just one with the FOB and one with my 4-fletch with the target style vanes. So I'll let you hear the sound. To me, the sound doesn't really sound much different. And then I took it a step further and I took both of those audio files and I opened them up in kind of like a frequency spectrum analyzer just to see if visually within the various frequencies, especially like the ones that deer are most kind of sensitive to, per some UGA research, which I'll try and link below in the description, I couldn't see much difference visually when I looked at those actual graphs. So it really brought up more questions for me than answers. It answered the original question of, are they louder? Which, based on this test, with this fletching configuration versus the FOB, I'd say it's not something at all that's significant, noticeable, or worth worrying about. But it also made me ask questions like, well, what would a bare shaft be like for comparison? What would a 3-fletch blazer sound like? Straight fletch, offset, helical. What about a 6-fletch? Right, so that level of testing where I think take a deeper dive into this is going to take a lot more time. It's not going to be something I get around to this year. All right, now let's jump into the pros and cons. So, advantage number 1, it is super easy to fletch. Literally, bare shaft, you stick this thing on, you put the nock in. It's that simple, which also means, advantage number 2, if you do want to shoot a bare shaft, say something's not quite right, you're not grouping like you should, you thought you saw some weird corkscrew, you want to test it with a bare shaft to see what's going on, did something go out of time, is my grip off, right? It's so easy to pop this thing off and just shoot a bare shaft and be able to see what that bare shaft is doing, and then pop it back on. Also, if you're one of the guys who likes to align your fletchings with your broadhead, if you're shooting like a three-bladed broadhead, which, to be totally honest, I don't think that's nearly as important as spine indexing your arrows and nock tuning. But if it gives you extra confidence, you do have the ability to line those things up with your broadhead blades. Another advantage of these is when you look at the profile, they have a much smaller crosswind profile than a standard vane would. Where I typically shoot here in Minnesota, all the ranges around me are heavily wooded. We don't have very high winds, especially in the summertime when the foliage is up. And if the winds are high, it just swirls all over the place and it's really next to impossible to get any kind of real quantitative data in regards to wind drift. But from some of the other guys that I have talked to that do shoot these things at longer ranges, have the more open settings to be able to test these things in, the standard thing that I keep hearing is that they do have less wind drift than a standard configuration. So the wind drift thing is definitely something that if you're often subjected to windy hunting conditions, I can see that making a lot of sense in terms of being a decision factor. And the last advantage is something that is also a disadvantage. I'll talk about why some people might consider this an advantage, and then I'll go into why other people might not. But basically, when you have a pass-through with this setup, you're gonna cause that FOB to pop off the back of the arrow. And how easily it pops off is gonna be dependent on your nock fit. Right, if you have a nock that is just super tight into your shaft and you need pliers just to rotate those things, it's gonna take a lot more energy to pop that FOB off than if you have a nock that's very easily sliding in and out of that shaft. If you have that FOB pop off, it takes a little bit of energy, right, to get that thing to pop off, but once it's off, then your arrow is able to continue to pass unimpeded through the rest of that animal. And basically it ensures that there's a very good chance if your broadhead doesn't wedge in a shoulder, and if you still have a little bit of momentum left over after that FOB pops off, you're likely going to get a full pass-through and this thing's going to be laying on the other side. The other potential advantage with that is that the FOB is going to drop off somewhere near where you hit that animal, which might not be as advantageous if you're at a tree stand, but if you're out west somewhere and you're like, whoa, like this all looks the same, I'm on ground level, I wasn't exactly sure where it was standing, having that thing laying on the ground could be just another clue that tells you, okay, I'm at least in the ballpark right here. So now let's jump into the cons. And we'll start with the con that I just said was a pro a couple seconds ago. And that is that on a pass-through with an animal, this thing pops off and the rest of the shaft passes through. Now I'm shooting a setup where pass-throughs are almost a given. I've had much more pass-throughs on whitetails than I have shots that don't pass through. And I set my arrows up that way. It's what I hope for and what I plan for is to try and get pass-throughs. And so if I get a pass-through and that fob bounces off, and typically from my experience, when it passes through a target, the fob doesn't usually drop right where that target was. It usually bounces back between 5 and 15 feet from where the target was. And then the arrow will keep on going. And depending on where you're hunting, it could snake itself in the grass, it could bury itself under leaves. If you're shooting out of a tree stand, hopefully you had enough momentum left over after that pass through that your arrow's sticking up out of the ground like this. But if it just kind of lays flat into the leaves, then again, you're basically creating something that's going to be very hard to find. And so from my perspective, having a reflective arrow wrap is an absolute necessity because that's going to make the arrow shaft a lot easier to find. I do not want to lose my broadhead. I want to be able to pick that arrow back up out of the ground, touch up the blades if needed, and put it right back into my quiver for the next time I go out hunting. If I'm shooting out of a tree stand, likely I'll have a much easier time recovering the arrow. But if I'm hunting on the ground and then I get a pass through, that arrow could be 10 yards past the animal. It could have skipped off the dry ground and gone another 60 yards. And without that lighted nock to be able to track that, I might just hear that arrow skipping off in the trees, and then I have no idea where it went. Right, so I might spend a really long time trying to be able to find that arrow, potentially not being able to find it at all. So from that perspective, I feel like it's more of an advantage shooting it out of a tree stand where you're shooting downward, and less of an advantage if you're shooting on flat ground and that arrow has the potential to go a lot further off of a skip or a pass through. If you're hunting in a lot of dense cover, you might accidentally have one of these things grab on some grass or weeds or whatnot and have one of those things pop off and then not realize it until you're ready to climb the tree. On some of your really thick arrow shafts, like I have a Day 6 250, which is a micro diameter shaft, but it's got a really thick wall. And so the OD is much larger on it too. It's more similar to the OD of a 204 diameter shaft. And because of that, the micro diameter fob actually won't fit on it. It actually is too small. And that just comes with the territory. They have to be able to pick a size that fits the range of most diameters of arrows. So if you're on the way extreme of OD for a particular shaft size, you just got to double check to make sure that it actually fits. The fob is something that for most people is going to be nock specific. When you notice when you get this thing to full draw, where this fob sits on your face, depending on how you're anchoring exactly, it could be giving you facial contact. If you have a shorter nock, it might cause more issues. If you have a longer nock, it's typically not going to be as big of an issue. The other thing to consider is string pinch. If you have a shorter axle to axle bow and you just have your D-loop tied on the top and bottom of that nock, you're likely going to have issues with string pinch. Whereas if you have a longer axle to axle bow, or if you have serving thread tied above and you're below your nock, the string pinch might not be as much of an issue. So like in this shaft here, you can see that I'm running a knockout lighted nock. And the nocturnals also worked pretty decent for these that I found, but a shorter nock caused issues for me. I put on some fire nocks and they were too short. Even with my serving tied above and below the nock, I was still getting string pinch, getting a little bit more facial contact. With the fire nocks also, you don't want those things popping off because you're probably going to lose your battery. So fire nocks and these are not really compatible. But for your other nocks, either standard or lighted, it just comes down to, how long is that actual nock? And typically the longer the nock, the easier time you're going to have being able to get a match. That said, if you cut off the ring and basically fletch this thing so it's got, like an odd feather out type of configuration, then usually you can run pretty much about as short of a nock as you want to and not have any issues with that string pinch. In my testing, it doesn't give you quite as good a flight as you get with the full ring. Now, with field points, it was pretty close, kind of tough to tell, but once I put, my compact fixed blades on there, then I could start to tell a difference where I wasn't getting quite as good a flight. So it's, again, going to be one of those things where your mileage may vary. It's obviously a lot lighter without that ring, less than or right around 10 grains. So if you're running a super high front of center setup, might be something to experiment with. So that was just kind of my opinion, a lot of thoughts. The biggest pro in my mind is wind drift and ease of use, especially when you're a tinkerer like me. And the biggest cons from my perspective are the fact that this thing pops off in a pass-through, which potentially makes it a lot harder to find your arrow and broadhead. Bottom line is, I don't think they're a gimmick, But I do think that there's pros and cons, just like with anything you can buy in archery, and ultimately your mileage may vary. You might be a person that absolutely loves them. I know guys that have used these things basically since they first came out and love them. And then I know guys who basically said it wasn't for them. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more information to be able to figure out if it's something you want to get. For me, it was worth it from the perspective of me being a tinker and just having some of these things laying around to be able to pop on when I find it convenient. Now, will I be running them for hunting? Well, I bought some Fire Nocks this year, and like I said earlier, the Fire Nocks really aren't very compatible with those FOBs because of the whole battery situation and the fact that the throat on this nock is so tiny. I like the way it's shooting, and I'm running these things with compact fixed blades. But that being said, I do have another arrow that is the exact same weight. It is hitting the exact same point of impact out to 60 yards, and this is basically an arrow with a FOB, a longer lighted nock, and a mechanical. So this arrow setup has an overall lower wind drift than this setup does. And then this is going to be kind of my low wind drift setup. Going out west this fall, hunting North Dakota, where you got a lot of open areas, and hunting Colorado, where you got a mixture. You might be in heavy dark timber, or you might be in kind of that more open aspen or open grasslands. If I'm in dark timber or I'm hunting heavy cover for deer, this is probably going to be the arrow that I pull out of my quiver and get ready to hunt with. Whereas if it's open terrain and say it's a really windy day, I might just put this on from the get-go. And my shots aren't going to be as long in that type of a scenario, but even on the shorter shots, any little bit that I can get with in regards to the wind could help. And for Sam's setup, she is shooting the FOBs as well. Initially, it was me just kind of being lazy and saying, hey, we're going to set this thing up, get you shooting, and you know, if you're shooting well, then we might switch you over to vanes. But she's been shooting really well, and she kind of likes the overall setup. So we're just going to leave it at FOBs for now until we have a reason to do anything otherwise. And if I thought that they were too much of a gimmick, I wouldn't feel comfortable with her using them. But like I said before, it comes down to they'll work. And you just got to figure out if it's a good decision for you, if it fits what you're trying to do. So if you are interested in the FOBs, after talking to some of the owners, they did give me a discount code to be able to share with you guys. That discount code is DIY10, gets you 10% off. And if you have any questions or experiences with the FOBs, please leave them in the comments down below. And thanks for watching.